Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Roy Kaufmann. Roy is the Director of Public Relations at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. He's also the founding member of the Professional Speechwriters Association, and he's been a speechwriter to the Governor of Oregon, Vice President at Hubble Communications, and a campaign strategist and spokesman. Roy, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to catch up with you. We were just talking about how crazy it is that we have not chatted in about 10 years.
Yeah, it is something else when you realize how quickly time is moving past and how busy everybody gets with their lives. So I was so flattered when you reached out and gave me the opportunity to join you for the conversation.
Oh, well, it's so good to catch up. We originally met when we were both living in Santa Monica, and I was in graduate school with your wife, Claire. And then after Santa Monica, I believed you moved to Portland. Is that right, or was there something in between?
No, we like the word fled. I think we fled to Portland. Yes, we moved up to Portland shortly after Claire finished her MBA program, and right after we had our first child. Our daughter was 8 weeks old when we left Los Angeles and moved to Portland, and didn't know anybody up in Portland at all. But we had been to Portland a couple of years prior to that on a road trip and sort of fell in love with the city. And that story has become such a cliched story in Portland because of just the rate of in-migration to the Portland region over the past 10 years. But we've been here, since 2006, so almost 10 years, and never looked back. Been grateful to have made the move.
Oh, that's great. So did you have a job there when you moved, or did Claire, or did you just move because you loved it?
I was fortunate enough to be able to secure an offer with a global public relations firm named Edelman. Edelman is I think the largest privately held independent PR firm in the world, and they have an office in Portland. And I was lucky enough to have an offer that allowed us to move up here. It was 2006, so the economy was still pretty strong, and so that kind of an offer was happening more frequently than it did in the years following. So that allowed us to move up here, and then Claire found work fairly quickly after we got up here.
Mm-hmm. And she is a digital marketer, is that right?
Yeah, she does digital marketing and branding work, and has worked with nonprofits and with consumer packaged good brands, and is looking at emerging industries and all sorts of stuff. And then I came up to work at this PR firm, but my background has been generally in political science and lobbying, political communications, that sort of work, and that's frankly what I continue to do, although I got to do some really interesting things in the past 9 years here in Oregon.
Oh, that's great. So you mentioned political science, lobbying, and then also you've been a public relations director. What does it mean? What do those different jobs mean for people who are interested but really have never dug in before? Yeah,
it's a great question, because when I was in school, as an undergrad, even in grad school, I really didn't know much at all about the public relations profession or about strategic communications. I thought my vision, or at least my thought at the time, was that I would sort of do the traditional foreign service route and go into foreign affairs work that way. And I didn't really have a much broader view of strategic communications otherwise. And so I had to learn it by doing it, which is frankly kind of the best way to learn something anyway. But a public relations director, a strategic communications professional, is really about working, whether you're in an organization or whether you're at an agency working with clients. It's really about telling a story. It's about engaging in a conversation. Some people sort of look at it as the complementary piece to advertising. If you think of advertising as paying to have your message show up in front of people in different media, then public relations is about finding ways to have your conversation in front of people in different media, but it's not in the advertising sense. It's through the articles. It's having reporters write about your company or write about your issue, or it's having columnists engage on the topic. It's about having members of the public want to talk to you or want to talk about the issue that matters to you. And in some cases, it's about managing your reputation or your brand, especially through crises or through issues that threaten a reputation, whether it's politically or for in the corporate sector, and that is only becoming a bigger and bigger priority as the media landscape continues to shift towards this sort of decentralized, social network-driven, online-driven atmosphere. You know, it was different when there were a few newspapers and there were a few TV stations and there were a few radio stations, and that was generally who was pushing out conversations, versus where we are now, where even in the course of my career, taking bloggers, for example, bloggers used to be viewed as the ultimate outsiders who probably wouldn't have been engaged by traditional companies in conversations, and now you ignore bloggers at your own peril because they are as much a source of news and information for readers as any other, in some cases more of a source than traditional media. So it's an interesting profession because it's constantly changing, and it's changing quite quickly.
Yes, and not to get off topic, but your point about bloggers is very well taken. There's actually a well-known blogger here in Memphis who will occasionally, mention my company. And, in addition to that, I'll do television appearances, sometimes radio. And when that blogger mentions me, and he just does this as a hobby, man, I can see a spike on my website. More than any other medium. And when it happens, I'll see the spike and I'll say, wow, where's all that traffic coming from? And I'll go, oh, wow, he mentioned me again.
Yeah, and it's this idea that we may not be pushing out a message to as large of an audience in terms of the gross size of an audience. But we might be pushing out a message or engaging in a conversation with a much narrower audience that genuinely cares about having the conversation.
Right.
And that takes a little bit of a shift of mindset from an organizational point of view, because organizations that might traditionally have measured their level of engagement in terms of volume now have to find other ways to measure that engagement that are still accurate measures that are new to them.
Absolutely. So I'm just curious, what did you study when you were in school?
I did my bachelor's in international affairs and focused on Latin America and sort of development economics issues. And then I did my master's in international affairs as well, and more focused on national security topics. And that's actually when I finished grad school. What I went initially to do, moved to Washington, D.C. after finishing grad school, and started working in Washington, D.C. As an aide to a lobbyist, I think 10 days or 11 days before September 11th, I think was my first day in Washington, D.C. So working in sort of defense and national security issues right before and then in the immediate year after September 11th was an incredible, in time surreal experience. But it was, it was invaluable. But it also kind of showed me, the difference between lobbying and communications, and how those two things go together, and how they're similar and how they're different. And for folks who are curious about what lobbying is, I know we hear that word a lot, and usually we hear it in a very negative context, and usually it's earned when it's in a negative context. But lobbying is essentially advocating for a specific point of view with a specific set of decision makers. That's really all it comes down to.
Okay.
It is a shame that it has become such a maligned word or such a maligned practice, because if you care about an issue, whatever issue it is, you have to put the work in to affect change on that issue. And one of the coolest things about being in D.C. was seeing just how many issues mattered to different people, things that you would never, ever think even existed, much less were a priority. But you spend time on Capitol Hill, and you will see groups coming through advocating for every possible thing under the sun from every corner of the country. And that, that part of it gets lost in the sort of overall concern for how lobbying is affecting our government, which is a whole separate conversation I would be happy to have at another time.
Yeah.
Maybe over some Oregon craft beer, but
right.
But yeah, we can have that conversation. But regardless, lobbying and communications go together very closely, and in some cases, at some public affairs firms, and I'll just define that term real quickly. A public affairs firm is effectively a public relations firm, but the difference is usually instead of working with a client that's trying to, for example, place their shoe in a bunch of magazines so people are aware of the new line of shoes, for example, or food products or whatever, they're usually working on issues. So companies are advocating to build a facility or to move a facility or to renovate something or to change policy one way or the other. And so public affairs firm is really a PR firm that focuses on issues as opposed to products. And that's an oversimplification, but public affairs firms usually either work closely with lobbying firms or even have lobbying as part of their offerings because the lobbying team will focus on engaging lawmakers and legislators, and the communications team will focus on engaging members of the media, community leaders, decision makers like that, and put together sort of a broader effort, recognizing that you need outside support from members of the community, and then you ultimately need the decision makers as well.
Oh, sure. No, that's really helpful, and it makes sense. I think I mentioned to you before we got started that I do have a number of clients right now who are interested in government, so I'm sure this information is going to be super helpful to them as they kind of, wade through some of their questions. So you have done a lot of really exciting things, and you've lived in a number of different cities. We were kind of talking a little before we got started in terms of, how your career evolved. I mean, when you started out, did you picture that you would be a speechwriter or a public spokesperson? Or, did these things cross your mind?
No, they didn't. I think that there were some core skills, and there are some core competencies that cut across all the different work that I in retrospect, I can see how those core skills of mine shaped the kinds of opportunities I got to have. And looking even just at sort of speechwriting and PR and spokesmanship, for example, the two that come to mind are a strong writing ability and comfort in front of groups, in front of crowds. Seinfeld has this great bit that I'm going to do a total injustice to because I'm not Seinfeld, but he basically says, the number one fear among most Americans is public speaking, and the number two fear among most Americans is death.
Right.
So he says, that means for most people, if they're at a funeral, they'd rather be in the box
casket.
and giving the eulogy. Yeah, and I'm like, that's. I've for whatever reason I've always felt really comfortable speaking in front of groups, and I've also always loved to write. I've always loved to read, and so my instinct for writing and my appreciation for good writing really shaped my interest professionally, and that's kind of how I got to do more and more writing, and ultimately do speech writing.
That's great. So as you went along, did you reach out to other people for advice? All
the time. I have done so many informational interviews. And I'm really grateful that the term informational interviews exists, because if it
Right.
didn't exist, then it would really just be nagging. It would just be begging for people's time and guidance, which is what it is, and it is such an important activity to do. It is. I'm not the career coach, but I would say it is one of the most useful things that anybody can do, and it's really, in my experience, if you do it from a place of genuine curiosity, then it can have incredible results. If you're doing it from a place of ulterior motive, if you're trying to have an informational interview just to get a formal interview, in my experience, it is less rewarding to do it that way, because people can sense there's a difference in how the questions are coming, or what the intention is behind the person seeking the informational interview. And if you come at something with genuine curiosity, that you really just want somebody's advice, who doesn't like to be asked for advice?
Right.
It's an incredible compliment to be asked for advice, and so. But I always encourage people, and I've always made time to give informational interviews to people coming up in their careers or looking for career changes, because I owe it to pay it forward for the amount of informational interviews I've conducted over my career.
No, absolutely. And, I think a lot of times when people come in to meet with me for the first time, they're hoping I will just say, I think you should go into sales or maybe operations.
They want you to be the sorting hat, right? They want you from the Harry Potter sorting hat. They want you to tell them what house to go into.
Right, exactly. I think you're so much better off when you learn it through experience, and when you talk with different people, you can get such a good sense very quickly for, do I relate to this? Does it make sense to me? Or does it just sound like something I would have no interest in doing?
Right. And I don't know about some of your listeners. I tend to be a fairly stubborn individual, and I will only learn something if I force myself through the process of learning it. If somebody else tells me something, even if it sounds credible, I will need to run it through the experience filter. I will need to do it myself to see whether it's true for me or not. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people, that you really absorb a lesson if you experience it yourself.
I totally agree. And, I think a lot of times job seekers have multiple good options. Maybe one is with a startup in California and another one is in your home state. And, both of those options could be great for you, but it just depends which one are you drawn to. And so, I can't advise on that. It's really comes from within the person to sort of learn what it is that they relate to, what it is that they truly want, because there may be a time in your career where you want, a raise, you want to make more money, and there may be a time where you want to focus on some personal priorities. So you want a job that's maybe less strenuous. And again, you may be able to do lots of kinds of jobs, but it's what's interesting to you, what gets you up in the morning, and really what's the best fit for you.
Right. And I think what you're talking about is a level of self-awareness that you cultivate over time, because there are so many factors at play, and we tend to focus on the most surface. And that I should probably speak for myself. In my experience, I have when I was younger, in the earlier part of my career, I focused on the most superficial factors of a position. What's the title, what's the pay, what's the job description, maybe what's the location of the job. Really surface topics, which are not unimportant. Mm-hmm. But as I've gone through my career, I've had trials and tribulations. I've had successes and I've had failures, and I have been able to start to look at those experiences more objectively and say, okay, what is the most important to me? What part of me is pushing for what part of this decision? Is this this decision being driven by my ego and the desire for a nice title or the desire for better pay? Is it being driven by an intrinsic curiosity in the work? Is it being driven? What's the motivating force for me?
Mm-hmm.
And I've used that approach when I've had multiple opportunities to pursue either multiple offers or even just trying to cull down a list of possible targets into the ones that I want to go after for interviews or for conversations. But I've been able to look back at times when I in retrospect, very clearly made decisions based on one set of values as opposed to another, and said, you know what, if I have the opportunity to do this again, I'm going to do it differently.
Right.
And that's a process of learning that comes with experience, but it also comes with being willing to admit to yourself where you were accountable for something and where, what motivated you at the time.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think it's great when your values kind of change and evolve over time, because they're changing along with your life situation. I think especially when you're younger, sometimes that title and the money really helps you to kind of expand your career as you get older. And as you do grow in your career, you can start to be more picky, and maybe the title doesn't matter as much. Maybe it matters more what you're doing and the job satisfaction. So I think it's pretty natural.
Absolutely. And I don't know that this is a logical place to suggest it to listeners, but get a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Find a mentor, whether it's in the profession that you want to enter, or within a company that you've recently started working at, or at any level of your career. I was just listening to an interview with, I'm blanking on who it was that was being interviewed, but the person was basically making the same point, that regardless of where you are in your career, a mentor can have incredible value. A mentor does have incredible value. I think it's, even if you're at this most senior level of your career, frankly, especially if you're at a very senior level of your career, finding somebody that can be a mentor to help you think through things and bounce ideas back and forth. It's not that's vested in your success, but it's not vested in a specific outcome.
Right.
That's so important, but especially starting out, it's so important. And it's just, I would strongly recommend people put that into their process.
I agree. And I think it's a good idea to seek out more than one mentor, because not everyone is great at everything. One mentor might know about a particular area and another mentor may know about another area. And I think it's really important to be aware of what it is that they seem to be the best at and to really utilize them for that part. And because I've found that sometimes I've had mentors that maybe go beyond their expertise and really try to advise me. And I've been fortunate to be kind of aware that I think they've gotten a little out of their little path.
Right, a little ahead of their skis.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great point, because it's also a burden, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but it is a large ask to make of somebody to mentor you, because the responsibility on the mentor is to try and give useful advice, and maybe that advice, similar to your coaching work, is a lot more asking questions than giving information. We tend to think of advice in the sort of this, Father Knows Best 1950s sitcom kind of way of like, well, come in here, I'll tell you everything you need to do.
Right.
Which might work for some people. I don't. It does not work for me. But a mentor who can ask really smart questions and make you come up with the answers, that is, in my opinion, that's the gold standard.
No, I totally agree, because you really need to learn to make decisions for yourself. If you're relying on your mentor to tell you everything to do, when does that end?
Right. And by making the decisions yourself, you are forcing yourself to own those decisions and own the repercussions positive or negative, of those decisions. But if somebody else says, go do this, and it's a success, there will always be a part of you that's like, well, is it all my success? And if it goes badly, there will always be a part of you that says, well, if I didn't listen to that guy, this wouldn't have happened. And so that personal ownership of your journey is so important.
I totally agree. So speaking of your journey, I was incredibly impressed when I saw some time ago that you were writing speeches for the governor of Oregon. That just blew me away. I mean,
well, thank you.
How did that start? I mean, how did you get involved with that?
I've done speech writing probably for the past, actually even before we moved to Oregon. When I was in LA working for different political campaigns, I started doing some speech writing for campaign candidates. And then it was always a part of what I did at PR firms, and the largely for executive clients in that case. The first time I got to really get significant experience with speechwriting was when I served as the communications director for the mayor of Portland from 2009 to the middle of 2011, and that's when I got to write, state of the city addresses and budget remarks and major press conference speeches and topical speeches and things that people call talking points, but my preference was always to write the speeches, and I discovered that I really enjoyed the process. I enjoyed the process of trying to tell a story, of trying to say something that would be memorable or that would be interesting to people who were listening to it, and at the same time to try and deliver a set of specific messages, specific priorities that didn't feel like somebody was standing up and reading their to-do list. Those are less interesting speeches,
right?
So I got to do a fair amount of speech writing, and then really sort of ramped up from there in different agency environments and political campaign environments, and ultimately the opportunity at the governor's office was something that I saw posted online.
Wow!
The subject. I mean, the position had I would imagine an intentionally vague title, something like senior communications advisor or something like that. But once you read the description, it was clear that what they were looking for was a speechwriter, and I just I jumped at the opportunity. I called everybody I knew that could have had any relationship in the governor's office and might have been able to help me get a meeting and have a conversation. Effectively, sort of lobbied for my own. On my own behalf to try and have the time in front of them to tell them why I wanted to do that work, and they ultimately gave me the opportunity, and it was a really, really interesting experience. And it was interesting because not just because of the breadth of the policy work, because if you're writing for a governor, you're writing about everything from sort of economic issues to public health and healthcare issues to public safety, economic development. I mean, everything. The chief executive of a state deals with everything, but also to try and find a balance between the natural voice of that principle that you're writing for and your own voice, what you bring to it. And so it was a really neat thing to get to do, and to be able to come in. And you and I were chatting right before we started this conversation about sort of the somebody else's voice, or speaking in somebody else's voice, or writing for somebody else,
right?
And about giving advice to somebody who's older than you, being younger in your career, and advising people who are older than you, or not even necessarily older, but just who have significantly more experience in a given environment. And in this case, I was writing for a governor who was running for his fourth term, who had been in public office, had been first elected to the state legislature in 1978.
Oh my gosh!
Which was one year after I was born. So had been engaged. I mean, growing up in a political household, was really engaged in politics from before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
So, it took a certain amount of moxie to come in and say, here is how I would do this.
Mm-hmm.
But whether it's in a political setting or whether it's in a corporate or a nonprofit setting, people who have been doing something for a very long time tend to have a particular way of doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes the benefit to them of having somebody younger with a different set of experiences come in is to say, well, have you ever considered doing it this other way?
Mm-hmm.
Here's why this other way might work better for you, or would you be willing to try this other direction? And that takes some nerve, but it also takes some confidence in your ability to advise, and you have to trust in the fact that if somebody has brought you on in this kind of advising capacity, that they want your advice. They want you to be honest with them about what it is that you would do.
Right. Well, you would hope so.
One would hope, and you know what? It doesn't always happen that way.
Right.
It doesn't. Even with the best of intentions, sometimes one will be brought into a situation to advise, and then anybody who's been a consultant anywhere for anything will tell you, this happens all the time, that you come in and you consult and you give your opinion, and the client ends up not wanting to do anything with that. And that's something you have to learn in your career as well, is when, how far do you want to push back, and at what point do you say, okay, I've pushed back as much as I can push back. I'll either implement what it is they want to do, or I can't, on principle, stand for this, and I'll walk away and let them do what it is. And that's decisions that are made probably every day by different people in consulting environments.
Right, because they're your when your client doesn't want to take your advice, they're still your customer, and
Exactly.
oftentimes that's their decision. So I'm just curious, when you do write speeches for someone, what does the process generally look like? Do you meet with the person in advance, or do you ever meet with them? I mean, what does it entail?
Yeah, so my preference is to be able to meet with them in person, and to get a sense of their voice and the way that most of the speech writing work, in my opinion, or at least in my experience, I should say, is on the front end in the research. Unless you've been writing for somebody for a very long time and you know their voice and you know what they would say and you know what they have said in the past on these kinds of topics,
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the work is on the front end in the research and finding out how they talk and what they're like in front of groups, and whether they're inclined to more of a sort of rhetorical flourishes, or whether they're sort of much more plain spoken, or whether they like storytelling, or whether they like statistics, or whether they like data or narrative. There's an incredible diversity in terms of the way people can give speeches. And the other thing that I really like to be able to do is I like to be able to work with people on the delivery of speeches, not just the writing of the speech. I think too often we think of speech writing as with the emphasis on the writing part, which is
Mm-hmm.
obviously hugely important, but ultimately a speech is an oral document.
Mm-hmm.
It can be shared, it can be read as a written document, but it is called a speech for a reason,
Right?
because that is the vehicle of delivery, the preferred and highest vehicle of delivery is
Mm-hmm.
is speaking it, and what will all too often happen is there will be, and I've seen this in political environments and I've seen it in corporate environments, there will be such a focus on the words themselves and the written document that there will be edits up till the last minute. And I mean that literally. I have seen people make changes to their speeches up until the seconds before they walk up to the podium to give it.
Wow.
Which I understand the impulse of, because you want it to be perfect, but what you risk in that kind of
the delivery,
that
right?
kind of approach is the delivery. Absolutely, there's the reason that I love speech writing is there is something that is still has an elevated status about it that we really don't see in a lot of other media of communications or channels of communication. When somebody gives a speech, there is still sort of a reverence, even if there's a cynicism around it. There's still sort of a reverence for what is said in that speech, whether it's a politician giving a campaign speech or a major speech, or whether it's a CEO giving a speech to investors or to their sales team. People put a lot of emphasis on that structure, and so the delivery of it is just so important. And that's something that I would love to see more people who give speeches think about and focus on. It's not just what are the words, but how are you saying them?
Right. No, absolutely. Well, so just to back up for just a quick second, I want to point out something that you mentioned that's really important. You talked about when you saw the job posting as a speechwriter for the governor of Oregon, you called everyone that you knew that might have a connection, and you took a lot of time to explore many different avenues simultaneously to go after it very aggressively because it was important to you.
Right.
And I work with a lot of clients who, first of all, this approach sounds very scary to them. So we spend a lot of time talking about it, how to do it. And I actually had a conversation with a client this morning who said to me, isn't that kind of breaking protocol? Isn't that kind of not how it's supposed to work? And my answer is, you're in sales in this moment when you're trying to get a job and you're selling yourself. You are the product. And I think any attempt that you can make to connect with the company, to connect with people you know who might know someone, and to really make yourself stand out aside from the other candidates, it's going to help you. It's going to really increase the chances that you'll actually get the job. And I think when you just apply online, if you had just applied to that posting online, I bet there's a chance that they may have never even seen your resume.
Oh, there's more than a chance, right? There's almost a certainty, just because of the volume of, the ease with which people can apply for a position anywhere on the planet. It is also probably one of its greatest challenges, is that an organization will be flooded with resumes and applications, and you regardless of whether the position is a sales position, you're 100% right. If you're applying for a job, you are selling yourself as a product, as a value add to that organization. And when I was applying, when I was interviewing for this position here at Lewis and Clark College, I was eager to get the position. I'd always wanted to be in a higher education environment. I've always loved sort of the energy of a university or a liberal arts college, and the kinds of inquiries and the kinds of intellectual curiosity that happens at places like that. And Claire, my wife, actually said something totally awesome, which is not surprising. But she said, she was like, Roy, nobody has ever not gotten a job because they were too eager to work there.
Right.
Nobody has ever been turned down for a job because the company said, that person is qualified, but they just want to work here too badly. That just doesn't happen. If you're not qualified for that role and you're eager, then yeah, you might get the brush off, but it's not because you were eager; it's because you weren't qualified for the position. But if you're eager and it comes across still in a professional way, you can be professionally eager. But I think that when companies or organizations are trying to make a hiring decision, and let's say two candidates on paper are almost identical, then wouldn't you want the person who was just that much more excited about getting to be part of your organization?
Yes, I totally agree, and it does sound like something Claire would say.
Yeah, I couldn't take credit for that one, but I listened,
right?
For sure, and I'm glad that I did, because by being more eager, by making phone calls, by not being afraid to explicitly say to the hiring manager, I would really love to be part of your team, and I know you said you would get back to me by the end of the week, and I know it's almost the end of the week, and I couldn't wait any longer. Where are you guys with this decision?"
Absolutely.
That eagerness coupled with a legitimate qualification for the position, it's a great combination.
Yes. And so often I feel like hiring decisions are made based on which candidate they like the best. It's hard to quantify like who is the smartest, who's truly the most qualified sometimes, but you can tell very quickly who's the most excited, who would I want to spend my day with. And I've even found for myself, I've gotten jobs where maybe I didn't meet all the qualifications, but I really wanted to work there and I was excited and I was a hard worker. And so at the end of the day, I was the person who got the offer.
Absolutely. I mean, that's 100% right. The job descriptions tend to be sort of aspirational lists. They when somebody creates a job description, they're thinking, okay, what is everything that we would want in somebody in terms of qualification and experience, and like what's the ideal? At least what's the ideal that we think on paper? But ultimately, every organization is a social grouping of some kind, and we are social animals, and we have to, ideally we surround ourselves with people that we want to be around, and that cultural piece that is so much more important than just what is on your resume or what's on the paper. My oldest brother, Eric Kaufmann, is an executive coach and a leadership coach, and he just wrote a book that is, I think, going to fly to the top of the charts in the next year or two.
Mm-hmm.
But he gives presentations to CEO groups all over the world, and he said that I think like 80% of major merger and acquisitions, corporate mergers, fail because of a cultural clash.
Wow.
Because the cultures of two organizations clashed,
Mm-hmm.
not because the financial side didn't work, not because it wasn't a strategic merger, not for any business reason. Ultimately, culturally, they were just too different.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that all the way from AOL Time Warner to the smallest of mergers, but we see it in multi-billion-dollar mergers as well. So that you can't overstate the importance of that human connection when you're in the hiring process.
No, absolutely. So speaking of sort of the human connection, we talked a little bit about you do public speaking, and you mentioned that you've always been comfortable with public speaking. What are some of the things that you have done over the years to improve your public speaking that you might give as advice to someone who's struggling?
Well, I did do some improvisational comedy when I was in Los Angeles, and I've always been a comedy nerd, comedy geek, comedy fan, whatever term
Mm-hmm.
people like to use. It was always an industry that I eyed, and a profession that I was always thinking of, and maybe in 10 or 20 years I'll revisit that. But
So you took classes at the Second City, right?
I took classes at Second City Theater in Los Angeles,
Right.
in improv and sketch comedy, and anybody who lives in any city in America that has an improv class, even at the community college, or even if it's at the local stand-up comedy club, but maybe it's once a week or just a short session, I would encourage people to give it a try, because what improv teaches you is it teaches you to be in the moment and to listen to your partner, and not to go for what is funny, but to go for what is true.
Mm-hmm.
And usually what will happen is the truest response will be the funniest, because if you are in the audience and you're watching something and somebody says something that is innately true, it will make you laugh,
Mm-hmm.
because you will recognize the truth in it. And also it just teaches you that you can't you can't be in your head with a bunch of prepared lines of what you're going to say, because you don't know where the other person is going to go.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what direction they're going to take the scene, and so you need to just be present in the moment and react to what they're saying. So I would strongly encourage it. It for some people it really takes them out of their comfort zone, but I don't believe that growth is possible within your comfort zone. That's why it's called a comfort zone. I think growth shouldn't be extremely painful, but it should. Discomfort is a great motivator for learning.
Right.
And the other thing I would say is, and this is probably not the world's most original idea, but just find opportunities to get in front of people. Find opportunities to practice. If it's in your local neighborhood, if it is sort of calling a meeting at work about organizing some volunteer effort or something, put yourself out there and find ways to get up in front of people, even if it's to speak for a minute.
Right.
Because for a lot of people, the fear is in the unknown of it all, of what's it going to be like to be up in front of people. And once they discover that, no, they're not in fact going to keel over by speaking in front of a group of people, then you can start to build your confidence. That said, I get nervous all the time before I speak. I still get nervous. Whether I do some stand-up comedy still on very, very, very sporadically, but whether I'm standing up to do some comedy, or whether I'm giving a speech, or whether I'm at leading a press conference or speaking at a press conference, I get nervous every single time before I get up on stage, and the nerves make me sharper. So I don't fault the nerves. I appreciate them, but I also think people should understand, they're not mutually exclusive. You don't become a good public speaker and then all of a sudden the nervousness just disappears. In a lot of cases, people are good public speakers because they're nervous, and it forces them. And Churchill, arguably one of the greatest speakers in the past 100 years, maybe even longer, was quietly incredibly nervous every time he spoke. And I've read biographies of Churchill that say that very much, that he's for being one of the greatest orators in Western history, he was profoundly nervous whenever he spoke. So much so that he sweat through his suits and his hands were clammy. And yet he got up and he gave some of the most important speeches in Western history. So, if Churchill can be nervous, you can be nervous.
Right, exactly.
That's my rule. If it worked for Churchill, it'll work for me.
Right, absolutely. You give some really good points there. A few years ago, I'm trying to think when, I took an acting class here in Memphis. I'd done some things like that in the past to kind of improve my speaking. And we didn't have like an improv troupe or an option here to do that otherwise. But I found it really helpful because, again, you learn a lot of these exercises and you're forced into a situation that is very uncomfortable, and you have to learn how to deal with it. And, people have made comments to me like, well, I don't want to be an actor, or why are you taking acting classes? You're not an actor. But it's really helpful when you're trying to learn to be a better public speaker. I mean, there are a lot of very common lessons that you can learn across, different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole modern practice of improv, of comedic improvisation, I believe came from or was heavily influenced by Viola Spolin, who created theater games. She was really the original architect of what has become the foundation of improv practice, of improv studies. It all came from theater and theater games and trying to help actors warm up and learn to be in the moment and to react in character in the moment, so that they could then take those skills and apply them in their acting. So I think you make a great point. Taking an acting class with no aspiration of being an actor, but just a desire to learn some of those skills is a really great idea, and it sort of goes with a complementary idea, which is diversify your learning. Go study stuff that you didn't necessarily think you might find interesting. When I first took an improv class, my first improv class at Second City Theater, I had this incredible teacher who actually went on to become a writer for 30 Rock, and then now is writing for a whole bunch of really incredible shows. But that teacher always said, go to Barnes and Noble, go to the local bookstore, and go to the magazine section and buy one or two magazines that you would never buy. Like, if you don't care about gardening, go buy a gardening magazine. If you don't care about hunting, go buy a hunting magazine. Go buy something that you would never buy, and then flip through it and read the articles and look at the advertising, and force yourself to confront material that you otherwise wouldn't encounter, and similarly, if you're driving home from work or you're driving to the grocery store, every so often switch up the way that you get there, switch up the way that you get home, take different roads, because we tend to get into an autopilot, especially as adults. We tend to get into these autopilot modes, and God knows it's happened to me more times than I can count. You get in the car, you turn the car on, you leave the office, and then, the next thing you remember, you're parking at home,
right?
And you don't have any real recollection of
how you got
the drive.
there.
Yeah, I mean, you're truly on autopilot, and that can be great at times. And for the most part, there's actually some recent data that shows that that's kind of a healthy way to operate for the most part. But the danger in that is that you are missing the opportunity to experience something new if you keep doing that all the time. You can't get different results if you don't change what you're doing.
Well, and, learning about things outside of your comfort zone, it's also very helpful for networking, which is helpful in finding a job, because if you can relate to a lot of different people, if you know about many different areas of things in the world, you can have a conversation with someone who's different than you.
100%, absolutely. And it gets back to that attribute or that aspect of being genuinely curious about something. If you can relate to what somebody else is saying, because you have even the tiniest bit of information about where they're coming from, and if you can find something to genuinely be curious about what they're saying, it will go a long way, and the other person will I believe intuitively pick it up. We may not call these things out. We may not even consciously be aware of the fact that we're picking these things up, but we are a species that is incredibly well attuned to nonverbal communication and to facial gestures and to voice intonations and to all these things that are well beyond just the words that we're saying to each other.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just have one last question for you. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but, you have worked in a few roles that were, related to government, as we discussed. And I believe one of your first roles was as a legislative aide for the Washington Political Action Committee. I actually recently spoke with someone who has had a career that's in the communications area, but is interested to shift over into something related to the government. What advice would you have for someone like that is just really not sure where to begin?
That's a good question. I would say I would encourage them to think about what are the issues or topics or industries that they are genuinely interested in. Not necessarily what are the industries that they want to work for, but what is it that interests them about a specific industry or a specific issue, and then the spectrum of organizations out there engaged in the political process, one way or the other, is just it continues to expand. And so there are always organizations that are looking for people to be helpful, to bring some insight to the table. And in a lot of cases, if it's a nonprofit organization, if it's a small advocacy organization, they're usually incredibly strapped for resources, and they tend to be, and this is again an oversimplification, but a lot of those organizations tend to have been started by people who are passionate about the issue, but don't necessarily have a whole lot of experience in a certain business function, whether it's finance or accounting, or whether it's marketing or some other function that allows the organization to succeed. And if you are willing to bring your expertise and your experience in a given function, a given role, to an environment or to an organization that needs that expertise, recognizing that maybe you want to transition out of accounting and you want to do something else. But in the interim, what if you were to be able to bring your accounting experience to an organization that would be incredibly grateful to have it? And you would get to work on an issue that mattered to you in a capacity that you already are confident in. That's trying to find those sort of intermediary steps that are logical in the short term for the organization, but that can have maybe a longer term runway. That's one place to look. And the other thing is sort of going back to the informational interview piece, and really the reading, not just going to the store and buying magazines you've never bought before, but there's the University of Oregon has a journalism school, and several times I have served as a portfolio reviewer, where they bring people in from the professional community to review graduating students, PR and journalism portfolios. And I've always found that the students who study other disciplines than journalism and PR, students who study foreign languages, students who study business or history or sciences, especially the sciences, and then on top of that have an interest in journalism or have an interest in public relations, are in such a stronger position because they have a subject matter. They're starting out, so they don't have a subject matter expertise, but they have a strong grounding in something, some set of conversations that are happening in the world, and they can overlay the communications work, they can overlay the PR, the journalism skills, but they understand how business works, or they understand how government works, as opposed to just understanding how to do the block and tackle, the tactical efforts of public relations, and so that's what I would encourage people to think about is broaden your horizons and get familiar with how the world works in different ways, because it can help you relate to the people. It can help you see opportunities that you might never have even thought of beforehand, and frankly, it's just a more rewarding way to go through our existence anyway, in my very humble opinion.
Right. No, that's fantastic advice. This has been great. So if any of our listeners are interested to learn more about Lewis and Clark College, where you're currently working, what is your website? Where should they go?
They should go to www.lclark.edu. Lewis and Clark is located in Portland, Oregon, the most wonderful city in America. Well, that's a little biased, but it is a great town. But they can check out the website. They can, and then they can certainly look me up on LinkedIn if somebody wants to get in touch with me about questions about speech writing or questions about communications, or if they want to do an informational interview, they can certainly contact you, and you can put them in touch with me as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Roy. This has been excellent.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Let's not let 10 years go by before we talk again.
I think that's a good plan.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to ensure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.